Hi there, I'm Michael Bott.
And I'm Rupert Soskin. Welcome back to Callanish Conversations. We're the Prehistory Guys, and today we're delighted to be joined by archaeologist, academic and Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Professor Dennis Harding. Now, during Dennis's extensive career, he was Vice Principal of the University of Edinburgh, where he was also the third holder of the Abercrombie Chair of Archaeology, which he held for 3 decades. He specialises in the British Iron Age and has written many books and articles on the period.
Aside from Professor Harding's long involvement with Callanish that we'll discuss with him in a moment, he's the only archaeologist we have interviewed who holds a private pilot's licence, which he has used to good effect, carrying out aerial surveillance on early settlements, hill forts and enclosures. His studies have ranged from wetland and underwater archaeology to Celtic art and, of course, Callanish itself. So we invited him along to chat about it.
Dennis, welcome, and thanks very much for joining us. Now, we're going to dive straight in. So to begin with, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to be involved with Callanish in the first place.
Well, I spent 30 years as Abercrombie Professor of Archaeology in the University of Edinburgh from 1977 to 2007. And one of the first things that I had in mind when I came to Scotland was that I wanted to make a contribution to Scottish archaeology. And it seemed to me very much that the Western Isles had been neglected by comparison with archaeological work in Orkney and Shetland, which had been extremely popular, not only in Scotland, but amongst other universities from south of the border. So I was interested in doing something in the West Highlands or Islands. I had, prior to that, also had some experience with Butser Hill, the experimental farm in Hampshire, and where we had built an Iron Age roundhouse based upon an excavation that I had done some years before in Dorset. And one of the principal ideas that I had was to establish, in a West Highlands or Islands context, a parallel to the Butser experimental farm, to engage in agricultural experiments and perhaps some building experiments as well. This together, of course, with the idea that a field centre that we could locate somewhere in the area would be useful to act as a base for students, as a residential base, a field centre for fieldwork and excavation in the area. So all of those things combined, and by the early 1980s, I was Dean of the Faculty, and in consequence was fairly frequently in contact with Sir John Burnett, who was at that time Principal of Edinburgh University. Now, he was a botanist and had held a chair of rural economy in Oxford. And so he was actually quite taken by the idea, and we met up on several occasions with Peter Reynolds from Butser Hill, and talked about the prospect of acquiring a property somewhere in the West in order to fulfill these ambitions. When eventually then the property at Calanais Farm, 200 acres around the Standing Stones, came on the market, I managed to persuade John Burnett and the Secretary of the University, Alex Curry, to buy it. I have to say, much to the chagrin of the Works and Buildings Department, who had the problem of trying to maintain it at long range. But that essentially was the way in which we came to acquire the farm. Now, the objectives, of course, were principally academic, that is to say, to conduct research, field research, and the experimental farm research, if we could get that launched. But one of the ideas that we had at the time was that we wanted a public interface of some sort. And so we developed the idea of having a visitor centre. And in fact, the buildings department of the university their architects did actually design a visitor centre, which was planned to go on the site now occupied by the car park. Right. And it was a rather, it was the kind of mimicry of the standing stones, because the main building was circular and it had radiating branches to lesser circles, so that it had a kind of molecular structure. It looked a bit absurd, actually. But we did think that launching the idea of the visitor centre might be the best way of publicising the whole exercise, because raising funds for the academic side was obviously going to be extremely difficult. And if we could somehow get publicity and attract public interest, it might ease the prospect of raising the academic funds as well. So that was how we came to acquire the farm and to launch the idea of the visitor centre. Now, of course, the realization of the visitor centre project necessarily involved much more local input than in the end from the university itself. And in particular, the Western Isles Enterprise, Archie MacDonald was in charge at that time in the 1980s, and Simon Fraser, who of course was local factor as well as solicitor in Stornoway. I'm just trying to remember, Sandy Matheson was the convener of the Islands Council, and they were some of the principal people that were involved from the islands end in promoting the idea of the visitor centre. Eventually, of course, it was taken over by Urras na Tursachan, and the island input became much more critical than the university's input. But eventually the thing was, of course, realised and opened in 1995.
I didn't realise that the Archaeological Field Centre and the Visitor Centre were so entwined, as together. I thought sort of one followed the other. But tell us a bit more about what went on with the Archaeological Field Centre. What did you do, and what was its aim?
There were two principal aims. One was obviously to mount a program of field research, which could be survey work or it could be excavation. And we launched two excavations in Uig Parish in the west. One was at Loch Varavat, and the other was nearby, also on the Valtos Peninsula, at the Loch Nabiri. Both of these were what popularly would be called broch sites, but they were both actually island brochs. Varavat was an inland loch up a ravine, quite a small site, a small loch and a fairly small island dune. Beery was rather larger and was in a dune slack behind the Macker. But both of those we worked on from 1985 onwards through effectively until 1995 when the funds ran out, and worked Easter and summer with student parties based on Callanish Farm. And of course we drove out in minibuses and each day.
It may surprise people watching, listening to this, or even visitors to the visitor centre to understand that the focus of those, of course, is Iron Age, not Neolithic. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. The choice of Callanish Farm was obviously, to that extent, fortuitous because our researches were not essentially aimed at Neolithic or Bronze Age studies, but were essentially Iron Age. But on the other hand, when Callanish Farm came on the market, obviously Callanish is such a well-known site and was plainly going to be an icon for the whole project, that we couldn't resist the clear advantage of taking up that site. But yes, you're quite right that Callanish was the bonus, I suppose, because our researches were not essentially based on that period of prehistory.
Yeah. Well, tell us, because you've talked about the visitor centre, but one of the things that you haven't mentioned is how you actually got the local community involved in getting that together. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I suppose that was where Simon Fraser came in, because he was a resident of Callanish village, and we very soon struck up a social arrangement with him. He was also the factor for the sites that we were working on in Valtos. In fact, I think he was probably the factor for a good many estates in the islands. I mean, he had a number of key projects. He was involved in community buyouts and things of that kind. So he was quite a well-known local figure. And it was largely through his support and endeavour that we got the community going. The other key figure was Colin Scott Mackenzie, who was what the locals called the Feasical, the Procurator Fiscal on the island. And he was a key figure in launching the Circle Callanish, the Friends of Callanish, who were one of the major supporting agencies involving the local community. We also, of course, had contacts with the Stornoway Museum. Richard Langhorne in the museum had been an Edinburgh graduate, and so I frequently met up with him in order to discuss the ways forward of meeting up with the community. So with a combination of Simon Fraser and Colin Scott Mackenzie and Sandy Matheson, we were introduced to fairly early on, and as I've indicated, the Western Isles Enterprise folk as well. Those were the key figures in creating the support and interest that were essential. I have to say also, actually, the other person that, of course, Donny Munro, obviously, was very much involved. He was rector of Edinburgh University at the time. And as we went out to the site every morning in the minibus, the students were all listening to Donny Munro's music and on their headsets. So he was another key supporter. And the other area of support that we got was from the West Highland Free Press. And I suppose one also should say the local MP for the Western Isles, who was also an Edinburgh graduate. It was all really rather sort of
an extraordinary complex, web of things coming together,
web of connections
to establish. So people don't realise what goes into these things.
Exactly.
And I'd like to say, Stonehenge apart, the other well-known visitor centre sites that there are up and down the land. You seem to be, your presence seems to be strong. Because you've got Calanais Visitor Centre, got Butser Ancient Farm, and I don't think you're
the other one
involved in. I was going to mention the Crannock Centre.
The Crannock Centre,
Loch Tay, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Well, of course, the Crannock Centre was also connected in two ways. First of all, Nicholas Dixon and his team came to the Western Isles and undertook underwater work in Loch Varavat. They also did a survey of dune sites and underwater sites in Lewis, and of course the reconstruction of the Crannog in Loch Tay was obviously very much in the same line of interest as the reconstructions that I had been involved in at Butser Hill and hoped potentially to launch in the Western Isles. That aspect of the program, of course, never really came off. We did launch the agricultural experiments. We had a year of growing beer barley under proper controlled scientific conditions on the Inbai at Callanish. But after that, the key figure, Patrick Topping, was recruited by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and so we lost our key man, and in fact funding the post would have been a problem anyway. Funding was a bugbear right from the start. Funding archaeological research which was not directly linked to development, in other words, which didn't come under Historic Scotland's rescue budget, independent research was extremely hard to come by, because not least because the major sources tended, of course, to be based in London or the southeast of England, and I have to say that the Western Isles of Scotland didn't perhaps feature particularly prominently on their radar.
Okay. Dennis, I'd like to sort of finish up with two questions, actually, because I know that work has been ongoing near and around Calanais, around the areas. Our good friend Duncan Garrow, as you know, has been diving on the Crannog up there. Were you surprised at when they were able to obtain Neolithic dates for the Crannog up there? I don't know if it's the same loch that.
No. Well, no, I don't think I don't think I'm not absolutely sure now in my recollection whether Nick Dixon in his survey work may have been involved in that particular loch. But the discovery of Neolithic material on these sites, of course, really was no surprise at all, because there had been older finds of Neolithic material from similar sites in the Western Isles. And of course, one of the things which came over very much from our own excavation work was the very long periods of occupation of these sites. I mean, yes, I've stressed that I'm interested particularly in the Iron Age, but I mean, most of the sites that we excavated went through to at least the 7th or 8th centuries, and in some cases into the Norse period too. So many of the sites have a very, very long period of occupation, not necessarily continuous, of course, but I mean, essentially what it means is that the sites that were available for settlement had the same appeal, whether it was from the Neolithic or through to the Norse or later periods.
Wonderful. It gives a different complexion to the whole area to remind people, of the breadth of time that they're looking at in the landscape round about there.
Yeah.
One more question, just to finish up, in this vein, Dennis. If you could go back to Calanais to excavate, to work, or whatever, what would be your focus? What would you do?
Well, I think certainly since you mentioned the underwater sites, certainly I think that is one area that could be enormously productive. And I was really very pleased to see that there was further work since we gave up being undertaken in that area. I suppose the main item of unfinished business was the site at Beery. in Uig Parish, where we didn't actually get down to the primary levels of occupation. And that was partly because the money ran out, partly because the site was scheduled as an ancient monument in 1995, and because it presented particular difficulties. You see, it was in a silted up loch, and the result was that obviously the more you dug down, the more the water started coming in. So we were working with we were working with pumps. Now, bear in mind that a broch has got a double stone wall. In other words, it's a double-skinned stone wall, and the stone walls are about 1 meter thick, both the inner and the outer. So it's a pretty substantial structure. So we introduced pumps into the cavity in between the two walls, pumping the water back out into the loch.
Oh, I see.
That means we were able to excavate in the interior 1 meter below the water level on the outside.
Wow.
Wow, yeah.
Now, of course, the moment that you stopped the pumps, the water would start to seep in again. And by the time you came back next morning, you had to put the pumps on, and it would take best part of an hour before you could get back to the primary levels.
Right.
Yeah.
So obviously one would need to have something much more sophisticated in order to do the job properly and to get right down to the primary levels. But the key thing is that because it was waterlogged, all the organic materials and all the artifacts made of wood and wicker work and all that sort of thing were surviving.
Oh, my Lord.
So the prospect of finding materials which you would not normally find on a land-based excavation were greatly enhanced.
Yeah.
And of course, at one stage, because the whole thing had been submerged, at one stage I did actually think that there was a prospect that if we could get down to the ground floor level, we never got to ground floor level, we were only excavating at modern ground level at what was effectively the first floor level of the broch.
Yeah.
If we could have got down to the ground floor level, I thought to myself, I wonder, are we going to find all the furnishings and fittings intact,
Little must
preserved?
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure that I actually believe that any longer, because I happen to think that the ground floor of brochs was probably devoted entirely to animal stalling. So that I don't know that you would necessarily find a great deal in the way of furniture or fittings that would be of great excitement. But certainly the primary levels are where you would get all the organic materials, and that, of course, complements the artifactual assemblage to such an extent that it completely transforms your understanding of the site.
Yes.
So that would be one thing that I would certainly want to do if I went back. But I think the other thing is looking to the future. There have been enormous improvements in the last 20 or 30 years in remote sensing technology. And the one thing, of course, that's always struck me, particularly struck me when I was doing my flying surveys of the Western Isles, is the extent of peat coverage. If you look at an area like Borv, for example, on the north side of Lewis, it's surrounded by a lunar landscape of peat. And underneath that peat, there must be an entire Iron Age landscape preserved and hidden.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we've got occasional insights as a result of peat digging in the past. So you look in the peat banks and you can see traces of walls and things of that kind. I mean, Trevor Cowie got them on the Leobag Peninsula at Callanish, and we got them on the Inbai area when the Hydro Board put underground the cables that were previously up on pylons. So there is a landscape underneath. Now, of course, the trouble is that it involves quite a lot of physical hard work, digging away 2 meters of peat in order to find the landscape underneath. And it would take quite some time to actually excavate such a landscape. But I wonder whether developments in remote sensing might perhaps mean that various forms of radar or ground penetrating radar or things of that kind would allow the possibility of survey work, which has not been possible without that technology, and whether that might be an area that could be developed in the future.
Yes.
It would certainly be worth looking at.
Yeah,
fascinating.
Well, it has
Let's
to be
hope.
said that, as you say, the advances in modern tech, that so many things have become possible in recent years that we never imagined previously. So
Exactly.
it can only continue, can't it?
Yeah.
Well, listen,
absolutely.
Dennis, thank you so much for joining us. We do need to wrap it up, but honestly, you have just so much to offer there. We must get you back for another chat at some point and go on at greater lengths of about all this stuff that you've done before. Thank you so much, and
Thank you, and good luck with the new visitor centre.
thanks very much. All right, take care.
Listen, bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.